Chapter 1. The Forbidden Connection. Emma sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the faint creases on the pillow beside her. The space where David should have been was cold and empty, as it had been for weeks. He had left for another business trip before dawn. His goodbye nothing more than a perfunctory kiss on her forehead. She stared at the clock on the nightstand, 6:47 a.m., and sighed. Another day stretched before her, monotonous and predictable, like the countless others before it. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines of gold across the room. Emma rose, her movements mechanical, and padded to the kitchen. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward like a ghostly whisper, and leaned against the counter. Her mind wandered, as it often did, to the life she had once imagined for herself, a life filled with passion, laughter, and connection. By 8:30 a.m., Emma was at her desk at the marketing firm, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she drafted a proposal for a new client. The office buzzed with activity, but she felt detached, as though she were observing the world from behind a glass wall. It wasn't until Liam's voice broke through her thoughts that she snapped back to reality. "Emma, you've got that look again," he said, his tone light but concerned. She glanced up to see him leaning against the doorframe of her office, his dark hair slightly disheveled and a mischievous grin playing on his lips. Liam was everything David wasn't: spontaneous, attentive, and unapologetically present. "What look?" she asked, forcing a smile. "The one that says you're a million miles away," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Everything okay?" Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to the papers on her desk. "Just tired, I guess." Liam studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You know, you don't have to pretend with me. If something's bothering you, I'm here." His words caught her off guard, and for a brief moment, she considered confiding in him. But the thought of admitting her loneliness, her dissatisfaction, felt too raw, too vulnerable. Instead, she shrugged and said, "It's nothing really. Just work stuff." Liam didn't press further, but his presence lingered, a comforting warmth that eased the tension in her shoulders. Over the weeks that followed, their interactions became a highlight of her days. They shared lunches in the break room, exchanged playful banter during meetings, and occasionally stayed late to work on projects together. It was during one of those late nights that everything changed. The office was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound as Emma and Liam sat side by side at the conference table, reviewing a client's campaign. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and by the time they finished, the sky outside was a deep indigo, dotted with stars. "I think we nailed it," Liam said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin. Emma smiled, a genuine one this time. "Yeah, we did. Thanks for staying late." "I know you didn't have to. I wouldn't miss it," he replied, his tone softening. "You're not the only one who enjoys this." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Emma's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to look away, to break the connection before it went too far. But she couldn't. There was something in Liam's gaze, a vulnerability, a longing that mirrored her own. "Emma," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know this might not be the right time or place, but I can't keep pretending. Care about you. More than I should." Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt a surge of emotions: fear, desire, guilt, all warring for dominance. "Liam, He reached for her hand, his touch sending a jolt through her. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." The weight of his confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Emma's mind raced, torn between the safety of her marriage and the intoxicating pull of Liam's affection. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. When they finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I I can't do this, she stammered, her voice trembling. Liam's expression was a mix of regret and resolve. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted, shaking her head. This is my fault. I need to go. She grabbed her bag and hurried out of the office, her heart pounding in her chest. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm raging within her. She had crossed a line, one she wasn't sure she could come back from. As she drove home, the image of David's face flashed in her mind, and a pang of guilt twisted in her stomach. She had always prided herself on being a good wife, a loyal partner. But now that identity felt like a fragile mask, one that was cracking under the weight of her unmet desires. When she finally walked through the door of her empty house, she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The silence that had once been comforting now felt suffocating, a stark reminder of the choices she had made, and the ones she still had to face. The days following the kiss were a blur for Emma. She tried to bury herself in work, hoping the distraction would silence the cacophony of guilt and longing that echoed in her mind. But every time she glanced at Liam's empty desk, he had taken a few days off citing personal reasons. Her chest tightened, and the memory of that night came rushing back. David returned home on Friday evening, his arrival announced by the sound of his suitcase rolling across the hardwood floor. Emma stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, her hands trembling slightly as she forced a smile. "Hey," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "How was the trip?" David shrugged, loosening his tie as he walked over to kiss her cheek. "Same as always. Meetings, presentations, endless small talk. I'm just glad to be home." His words should have comforted her, but they only deepened the ache in her chest. She wanted to feel something, relief, joy, even annoyance, but all she felt was a hollow emptiness. Dinner was a quiet affair, the clink of cutlery against plates the only sound in the room. David talked about his trip, his voice steady and measured, but Emma barely registered his words. Her mind kept drifting to Liam, to the way his hand had felt in hers, the way his lips had pressed against hers with a desperation that mirrored her own. "Emma!" David's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to find him studying her with a furrowed brow. "Are you okay? You seem distracted." She forced a smile, her stomach churning with guilt. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." David nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he returned to his meal. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, and by the time they went to bed, Emma felt as though she were suffocating under the weight of her secrets. The following Monday, Liam returned to work. Emma saw him the moment she stepped off the elevator, his familiar figure leaning against the reception desk as he chatted with the receptionist. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly averted her gaze, pretending not to notice him as she made her way to her office. But he noticed her. "Emma," he called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the office. She froze, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "Liam, welcome back." He approached her, his steps slow and deliberate, as though giving her time to retreat. When he reached her, he lowered his voice, his tone tinged with concern. "Can we talk? Please?" Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she should say no, should walk away and put as much distance between them as possible. But the look in his eyes, pleading, vulnerable, made her nod. They found an empty conference room, the glass walls offering a semblance of privacy while still keeping them in full view of the office. Emma crossed her arms over her chest, her posture defensive, as she waited for him to speak. "I've been thinking about what happened," Liam began, his voice low and earnest. "And I need you to know that I didn't mean to make things complicated. Care about you, Emma. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. But I don't want to hurt you." His words were like a balm to her frayed nerves, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. But then reality came crashing back, and she shook her head. "We can't do this, Liam," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm married. It's wrong." He stepped closer, his gaze intense. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like the only thing that's right. Emma's resolve wavered, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this connection between them was worth the risk. But the thought of David, of the life they had built together, held her back. I need time, she said finally, her voice trembling. I need to figure out what I want. Liam nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and disappointment. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. The rest of the day passed in a haze, Emma's mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She tried to focus on her work, but every time she glanced at Liam's desk, her heart ached with a longing she couldn't ignore. That evening, as she sat on the couch with David, the TV playing softly in the background, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. David reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar, but it only made her feel more disconnected. Emma, he said, his voice gentle, is something going on? You've been distant lately. She looked at him, her heart breaking at the concern in his eyes. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth, confessing everything and begging for his forgiveness. But the words caught in her throat, and she shook her head. I'm just stressed, she lied, forcing a smile. Work's been crazy. David nodded, but his gaze lingered on her, as though he could see through her facade. Okay. Just know that I'm here for you no matter what. His words were a dagger to her heart, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, but the guilt only grew heavier. As the night wore on, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds, two men. But the thought of choosing, of losing one of them, was unbearable. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act for Emma. She oscillated between moments of clarity, where she vowed to end things with Liam, and moments of weakness, where she found herself drawn back to him like a moth to a flame. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant companion that shadowed her every move, but the thrill of being wanted, of feeling alive, was intoxicating. David, meanwhile, remained oblivious, his trust in her unwavering. He continued to pour himself into his work, his presence at home growing increasingly sporadic. Emma told herself that his absence made it easier to justify her actions, but deep down, she knew it was just another layer of deception. One evening, as she sat at her desk, staring at a blank document on her computer screen, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Liam. Asterisk, can we talk? I need to see you. Asterisk. Her heart raced as she read the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She knew she should ignore it, should delete his number and block him from her life. But the thought of never seeing him again, of never feeling his touch, was unbearable. Against her better judgment, she replied. Asterisk, meet me at the park. 7 p.m. Asterisk. The park was quiet, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Emma sat on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she waited for Liam to arrive. When she saw him approaching, her breath caught in her throat. He looked as handsome as ever, his coat slung over one arm, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. Hey, he said softly, sitting down beside her. Hey, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Liam spoke. I can't keep doing this, Emma, he said, his tone heavy with emotion. I can't keep pretending that what we have isn't real. I love you. His words hit her like a punch to the gut, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes. Liam, I know you're scared, he continued, reaching for her hand. I know this isn't easy. But I can't keep living in the shadows, waiting for you to choose me. You deserve to be happy, Emma. And so do I. She looked at him, her heart breaking at the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She wanted to tell him that she loved him too, that she wanted to be with him. But the thought of leaving David, of appending her life, was terrifying. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice trembling. Liam squeezed her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just think about it. Think about what you really want. The conversation left her more conflicted than ever, and as she drove home that night, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds, two men. But the thought of choosing, of losing one of them, was unbearable. When she walked through the door, she found David sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect you to be home." "I finished early," he replied, his tone neutral. "Where were you?" The question caught her off guard, and she felt a surge of panic. "Just out for a walk. Clearing my head." David nodded, but his gaze lingered on her, as though he could see through her lies. "Emma, we need to talk." Her heart sank, and she felt a cold dread creeping up her spine. "About what?" He set his glass down on the coffee table and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I know something's been going on with you. You've been distant, secretive. And I need to know if there's someone else." The room seemed to spin, and Emma felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. She opened her mouth to deny it, to reassure him that everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling in her lap. "David, He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Just tell me the truth, Emma. Please." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, the weight of her guilt finally too much to bear. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. David's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. For a moment, he said nothing, the silence between them deafening. Then he stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the window, his back to her. "How long?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely audible. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "Why, Emma? Why would you do this?" She shook her head, her tears falling faster now. "I don't know. I was lonely and he made me feel wanted. I never meant to hurt you." David's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Well, you did. You broke us, Emma. You broke everything." The finality of his words hit her like a blow, and she felt a sob escape her lips. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, her voice breaking. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and regret.